A father dumped his disabled daughter in a forest, thinking no one would ever find out. He left her alone in a broken wheelchair with no food, no way home, and no goodbye. But what he didn't know was that a mysterious man was watching, someone who had lost everything and wasn't about to let this girl be forgotten. Who is this man hiding in the woods? And what will happen when he uncovers the father's dark secret, one that could destroy everything? This story will break your heart, then slowly put it back together. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Wren mansion, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Nathan Wren adjusted his steel gray tie for the 10th time, practicing his winning smile in the hallway mirror. His reflection showed exactly what he wanted the world to see: a successful tech CEO with perfect white teeth and carefully styled salt and pepper hair. "Remember," he muttered to himself, "family values are the cornerstone of everything we do at Wren Tech." The practiced line rolled off his tongue smoothly, just as it would for the upcoming interview. In the adjacent room, Marissa Lang perched on a white leather ottoman, leaning close to an illuminated makeup mirror. Her slender fingers dabbed concealer under her eyes with practiced precision. "Honey," she called out, "should I wear the cream blazer or the blush pink one for the interview?" "The cream," Nathan replied without hesitation. "It photographs better and matches our home's aesthetic." He walked into the room, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the floor. "We need to look like the perfect family unit." Down the hall, in a smaller room tucked away from the mansion's showpiece areas, Alara sat quietly in her wheelchair. Her small hands moved across the pages of a worn sketchbook, creating intricate drawings of robots and machines. The sound of her pencil scratching against paper was barely audible over the busy preparations elsewhere in the house. The camera crew arrived right on schedule. They transformed the living room into a makeshift studio, positioning lights and adjusting microphones while Nathan and Marissa took their places on the pristine white sofa. An assistant wheeled Alara into frame, positioning her wheelchair at what the producer called the perfect angle. "Mr. Wren," the interviewer began, her voice warm and professional, "your company's success is remarkable, but what our viewers really want to know is, how do you balance being a tech industry leader with family life?" Nathan's rehearsed smile widened. He reached over to pat Alara's hand, his touch light and camera perfect. "Family comes first, always. Everything I do at Wren Tech is about creating a better future for my daughter." He squeezed Alara's hand a fraction too tight. "And of course, with my upcoming wedding to Marissa, we're expanding our little family unit." Marissa beamed on cue, her hand resting perfectly on Nathan's arm. "Nathan is such a devoted father," she added, her voice honey sweet. "The way he balances his work with quality time with Alara is truly inspiring." Throughout the interview, Alara sat still, her face carefully neutral. She'd learned long ago how to become almost invisible during these performances. Her father answered questions about their supposed game nights and weekend adventures, activities that existed only in press interviews and social media posts. After the crew packed up and left, Nathan's demeanor shifted subtly. His smile remained, but it no longer reached his eyes. "Alara," he said, clapping his hands together, "I have a wonderful surprise." He paused for effect, looking between her and Marissa. "With the wedding coming up next month, I thought we should have some special father-daughter time. How about a camping trip? Just you and me?" Alara's pencil paused mid-sketch. She looked up at her father, confusion flickering across her face. In their 10 years together, they had never gone camping. The closest they'd come to outdoor activities were staged photo shoots in the backyard. "Camping?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying a hint of hope she couldn't quite suppress. "Yes, sweetheart, stargazing, telling stories, real quality time." Nathan's voice was smooth as silk. "We'll leave tonight, make it a spontaneous adventure." From her position on the sofa, Marissa's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her phone. "Tonight?" she asked, her tone carefully controlled. "But Nathan, what about the vendor meeting tomorrow?" "Reschedule it," Nathan said dismissively. "This is more important. He turned back to Alara. "What do you say, princess?" Alara's eyes darted between her father's face and her sketchbook. Something felt off, but the prospect of actual time with her father, time without cameras or practiced speeches, made her heart flutter with cautious excitement. "Okay," she said softly. The drive out of the city took them through gradually darkening streets and onto winding roads. Alara watched the urban landscape give way to scattered trees, then dense forest. Her wheelchair was secured in the back of Nathan's luxury SUV, along with a single backpack he'd packed himself. As dusk painted the sky in deep purples and blues, they turned onto a narrow dirt road. Alara noticed there wasn't any camping gear visible in the car. No tent, no sleeping bags, no cooler for food. "Dad," she ventured, "where's all the camping stuff?" Nathan's hands flexed on the steering wheel. "It's a special spot, sweetheart. There's a cabin rental nearby with everything we need." The lie came easily, wrapped in his usual smooth tone. "But first, I want to show you something amazing. The stars out here are incredible." They parked at the edge of a clearing. Nathan helped Alara into her wheelchair and pushed her to a flat spot near some trees. He set up a small tent with practiced efficiency, the only piece of camping equipment he'd brought, while telling her stories about constellations and ancient myths. "Look," he pointed upward. "That's Cassiopeia, the queen who boasted too much about her beauty." His voice took on a storyteller's rhythm, keeping Alara's attention on the sky while he quietly moved around the campsite. The night air grew cool, and Alara's eyes began to feel heavy. Nathan helped her into the tent, making sure she was comfortable on the sleeping bag he'd laid out. "Get some rest, princess," he said, his voice oddly distant. "I'll be right outside." As Alara drifted toward sleep, the sound of quiet footsteps and careful movements filtered through her consciousness. The soft click of the SUV's trunk opening and closing, the crunch of leaves under careful feet. But sleep pulled at her more strongly than curiosity, and her eyes remained closed. In the darkness outside, Nathan moved with purpose. He loaded his backpack into the SUV, careful to make minimal noise. A small black device, a GPS jammer, was already tucked safely inside. His face, no longer carrying any trace of warmth or fatherly affection, was illuminated briefly by the SUV's interior light as he slipped into the driver's seat. The next day, the morning mist crept across the forest floor like ghostly fingers, turning the woods into a haunting landscape of shadows and silence. Alara stirred in her sleeping bag, her body stiff from the cold that had seeped through the thin fabric during the night. Her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the gray light filtering through the open tent flap. "Dad?" Her voice came out hoarse and small. The silence that answered made her stomach clench. "Dad, are you there?" The tent flap swayed gently in the morning breeze, revealing glimpses of an empty campsite. No crackling fire, no smell of breakfast, no sound of movement, just endless trees and that creeping mist. Alara pushed herself up on her elbows, her heart beginning to race. Her wheelchair sat just inside the tent's entrance, but beyond that, there was no sign of the luxury SUV that had brought them here. No sign of her father. "Dad!" she called louder, her voice cracking. Birds scattered from nearby trees, their wings flapping in sudden bursts. "This isn't funny." With trembling hands, Alara pulled herself into her wheelchair, a movement she'd perfected over years of practice. Her backpack lay beside her sleeping bag, and she quickly inventoried its contents. A half-empty water bottle that sloshed mockingly, a single protein bar, her beloved sketchbook, and a small pill container. She shook the container. Only 2 doses of her medication remained. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, trying to channel the quiet strength her therapist had always encouraged. "Think logically." She reached for her phone, but the GPS app only showed a spinning wheel. No signal, no location, nothing. Panic rose in her chest like a tide, threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She had to move, had to find help. The wheelchair's wheels caught on every root and stone as she pushed herself out of the tent. The morning air bit at her exposed arms. She hadn't even brought a jacket. "Help!" she screamed. her voice echoing through the trees. "Somebody help me!" Only the mockingbirds answered, mimicking her cries in haunting echoes. The forest floor was a nightmare of obstacles. Pine needles and leaves made the wheels slip, while protruding roots threatened to tip her chair with each attempted push forward. She tried to remember which direction they'd come from, but the mist made everything look the same, an endless maze of tree trunks and shadows. The first time her chair tipped, she managed to catch herself before fully falling. The second time wasn't so lucky. The left wheel caught on a hidden root, and suddenly she was sprawled on the damp ground, dirt and leaves pressing against her cheek. Tears burned in her eyes as she struggled to right herself in the chair. "Think," she muttered, brushing dirt from her clothes. "Think like an engineer." She'd spent countless hours sketching robotics designs, studying mechanics. Surely she could figure this out. But all her knowledge of servo motors and artificial intelligence couldn't help her navigate this primitive wilderness. Her arms ached from the effort of constantly righting her chair and pushing through the unforgiving terrain. The morning sun had begun to burn away the mist, but it offered no warmth against the chill that had settled into her bones. She took a small sip of water, trying to make it last. That's when she noticed the piece of paper crumpled at the bottom of her bag. Her hands shook as she smoothed it out, recognizing her father's precise handwriting. "I'm sorry. Be brave." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Sorry? Sorry for what? For leaving her alone in the wilderness? For every false smile, every staged photo op, every moment of carefully orchestrated fatherhood that had never felt quite real? The sun climbed higher, but the forest remained stubbornly cold. Alara's movements became slower, clumsier. Her throat felt like sandpaper, but she couldn't risk finishing the water. Not yet. She had to keep moving, had to find help. The wheelchair caught again, this time sending her tumbling down a small incline. She landed hard beside a dry creek bed, the impact knocking what little air remained from her lungs. The chair followed, one wheel spinning uselessly above her. Everything hurt. Her arms felt like lead, her head spun, and her chest seemed too tight to draw proper breath. The protein bar remained untouched in her bag. Her stomach was too knotted with fear to even consider eating. "Help," she whispered, but her voice had given out. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. Was this shock? She'd learned about it in biology class. The body's response to trauma, to extreme stress. Her fingers and toes had gone numb, and her thoughts were becoming fuzzy around the edges. High in a nearby tree, hidden among the branches, a small red light blinked steadily. The wildlife camera's lens adjusted silently, capturing every moment of Alara's struggle. Its motion sensors had activated hours ago, recording her first desperate attempts to leave the campsite, every fall, every cry for help. Miles away in a small cabin far from any marked road, a man sat before a bank of monitors. His eyes never left the screen showing Alara's crumpled form beside the dry creek bed. The camera's high-definition feed captured every detail, the tears tracking through the dirt on her cheeks, the way her hands trembled as she tried to push herself up one more time, the utter isolation of a child abandoned in the wilderness. The man's fingers hovered over his keyboard, his face illuminated by the glow of multiple screens. Each monitor showed a different angle of the forest, different cameras capturing different moments of Alara's morning of terror. The footage played on, a silent testament to a father's betrayal and a daughter's fight for survival. The bank of monitors cast a blue glow across Jonah Reed's weathered face as he leaned back in his creaking wooden chair. His thick beard, streaked with gray, couldn't hide the deep frown lines etched around his mouth. The cabin's interior was a testament to isolation. Survival gear hung from rough-hewn walls, military-grade medical supplies filled metal shelves, and outdated but functional technology cluttered every available surface. He took a sip of black coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste, and clicked through the overnight wildlife camera feeds. Usually, these early morning reviews showed deer paths, the occasional bear, maybe a mountain lion if he was lucky. The footage helped him track animal movements, maintain his self-imposed solitude, and keep his sector of the forest under surveillance. But today was different. His hand froze on the mouse, coffee cup halfway to his mouth. On screen 3, instead of the usual nocturnal wildlife, he saw a child. A young girl in a wheelchair, calling out into the darkness. The timestamp showed 3:47 a.m. "What the hell?" he muttered, setting down his cup so hard that coffee sloshed onto the desk. Jonah leaned forward, his eyes scanning every detail of the footage. The girl's desperate attempts to navigate the rough terrain, her calls for help, the way she kept checking her phone despite the obvious lack of signal. His jaw clenched as he watched her chair tip over repeatedly. A memory flashed unbidden. Different woods, different time. A young girl with wild, curly hair and bright eyes, showing him her latest robotics design. "Look, Dad. This could help people walk again." Jonah shook his head hard, forcing the image away. He hadn't thought about Ava in... No, that wasn't true. He thought about her every day. He just didn't let himself remember. The current footage showed the girl still moving, but barely. Her movements were becoming erratic, uncoordinated. Signs of dehydration, possibly early shock. His combat medic training kicked in automatically, cataloging symptoms. "Not your problem," he growled to himself, but he was already standing up. "Not your business, not your dash." Another memory. Ava's voice clear as day. "Everyone deserves help, Dad. That's what makes us human." Damn it. Jonah grabbed his go bag from beside the door. Always packed, always ready. He added extra medical supplies, IV bags, emergency blankets, glucose tablets. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from years of field medicine. The GPS coordinates from the camera's metadata showed the girl's location about 2 miles southeast of his cabin. He could make that in 30 minutes, less if he pushed hard. The sky outside was darkening despite the early hour, storm coming in. As Jonah stepped outside, his boots crunching on gravel, another unwanted memory surfaced. The screech of tires, the crunch of metal, the deafening silence afterward. The day he lost everything, his daughter, his purpose, his connection to the world. He hadn't spoken to another person in 3 years, 4 months, and 12 days. Not since the funeral. Not since he'd walked away from civilization and built this life of solitude, surrounded by nothing but trees and wildlife and the ghosts of his past. "Just check on her," he muttered as he started jogging through the forest. "Make sure she's okay. Call it in. That's it." But he knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing ever was. The forest floor was familiar territory. He'd mapped every inch of it during his self-imposed exile. His feet found the safest paths automatically, avoiding the loose rocks and hidden roots that had caused the girl so much trouble. The storm clouds gathered overhead, turning morning into twilight. Another memory, teaching Ava to navigate through woods just like these. "Always look 3 steps ahead, kiddo. Plan your path." Jonah pushed himself faster, his breath coming in controlled bursts. The weight of the medical kit thumped against his back with each stride. The coordinates led him toward the old creek bed, dry now, after months without rain. As he got closer, he saw signs of the wheelchair's passage. Broken twigs, disturbed earth, places where the chair had obviously tipped. He found her exactly where the last camera footage had shown. The girl lay crumpled beside her overturned wheelchair, one wheel still spinning slowly in the strengthening wind. Her skin was pale, lips slightly blue. Early shock symptoms, just as he'd feared. Jonah dropped to his knees beside her, medic training taking over. Pulse, present but weak. Breathing, shallow but regular. Skin, cool and clammy. He pulled out a water bottle and emergency blanket. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Can you hear me?" No response. He lifted her head gently, helping her take small sips of water. Some of it spilled down her chin, but she swallowed reflexively. Good sign. Thunder rumbled overhead as Jonah unfolded the emergency blanket and wrapped it around her. The girl stirred slightly, mumbling something incoherent. Her eyes fluttered but didn't open. "Okay, time to move," he said, more to himself than to her. The storm was almost upon them, and she needed proper medical attention. He pulled a lightweight tarp from his pack and fashioned it into a makeshift sled, an old trick from his military days. With careful movements, Jonah lifted the girl onto the tarp. She was light, too light in his arms. For a moment, he was transported back to carrying Ava to bed after she'd fallen asleep working on her projects. He pushed the memory away. Focus on the present. Focus on the task. He secured the girl in the tarp sled, making sure she was well wrapped in the emergency blanket. The wheelchair would have to wait. He'd come back for it later. Right now, getting her to shelter was the priority. As Jonah began dragging the sled through the forest, the first fat raindrops fell through the canopy. The girl shifted slightly, making a small sound of distress. "What the hell were you doing out here, kid?" he muttered, adjusting his grip on the tarp's edges. The storm was building rapidly now, wind whipping through the trees overhead. No answer came from the unconscious girl, just the growing rumble of thunder and the steady sound of his boots on the forest floor. Jonah pressed on, keeping his pace measured despite the urgency building in his chest. Each step took them closer to his cabin, closer to breaking his carefully maintained isolation, closer to a world he'd walked away from years ago. The rain began to fall in earnest, drumming against the tarp and dripping from the trees. Jonah hunched his shoulders against it and continued forward, trying not to think about how this moment would change everything. Thunder cracked overhead as Jonah finally reached the cabin, his muscles burning from dragging the makeshift sled through the increasingly muddy terrain. Rain pelted down in heavy sheets now, soaking through his jacket. The girl hadn't stirred during the entire journey, which worried him. A low whine greeted him as he shouldered open the cabin door. Rusty, his black retriever, limped forward to investigate, his graying muzzle showing his age. The dog's bad hip didn't stop him from being alert, though. "Easy, boy," Jonah murmured, carefully maneuvering the tarp sled through the doorway. "We've got company." Jonah lifted Alara onto the narrow cot in the corner of the main room, the same one he used when his back couldn't handle the loft bed upstairs. His medic training took over as he assessed her condition in the better light. Skin still clammy, pulse weak but steady. The fever was new, likely from exposure. He found his old field medical kit in a storage trunk, pulling out IV supplies that were still within their expiration dates. His hands remembered the motions perfectly, finding a vein, inserting the needle, hanging the bag from a makeshift stand made from an old coat rack. Some skills never left you, even after years. Rusty patted over, sniffing gently at Alara's hand where it hung off the cot. The dog's tail wagged slowly, more curious than concerned. Jonah allowed himself a small smile. Rusty had always been a good judge of character. While checking Alara's pockets for any medical information, he found her medication bottle, nearly empty, with only one dose left. He read the label carefully, recognizing the drug as one that shouldn't be stopped abruptly. After a moment's consideration, he helped her swallow the last pill with a few drops of water. The cabin felt different with another person in it, smaller somehow, despite its reasonable size. Jonah moved around the space with careful steps, hyper-aware of every creak in the floorboards. He hadn't needed to be quiet in years. It was usually just him and Rusty, and the dog didn't mind noise. About an hour later, Alara began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion clear on her face as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. When she spotted Jonah, fear flickered across her features. "You're safe," Jonah said, his voice rough and unpracticed. The words felt strange in his mouth. He'd gotten used to talking only to Rusty. "Found you. By the creek." Alara tried to sit up, then winced. "My father," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Where's my father?" Jonah busied himself checking the IV line, buying time to choose his words carefully. "Didn't see anyone else out there," he said finally. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence was kinder than truth. "Oh." The word was small, heavy with understanding beyond her years. Rusty chose that moment to approach again, resting his chin on the edge of the cot. Alara's hand automatically went to scratch behind his ears, and some of the tension left her shoulders. "That's Rusty," Jonah offered. "He's friendly." The next few hours passed in a careful dance of necessary interaction. Jonah checked her vitals regularly, marking them in an old notebook. He heated up some soup, one of his better batches, made with actual vegetables from his small garden. Alara ate slowly, her eyes often drifting around the cabin. While she rested, Jonah worked on her wheelchair. The right wheel had come loose during her journey through the forest, but it was an easy fix with his tools. He could feel her watching him as he worked, but he kept his focus on the task. Sometimes silence was easier than fumbling for words. As afternoon faded into evening, Alara began exploring the cabin from her newly repaired chair. Jonah watched from the corner of his eye as she took in the details of his isolated life. The solar panel setup visible through the window, the carefully organized supplies, the stack of books on engineering and robotics gathering dust on a shelf. She paused at a framed photo on the wall, the only one in the cabin. A young girl with wild curly hair grinned at the camera, holding up what looked like a robotic arm made from spare parts. Jonah's throat tightened as Alara studied the picture. "Is she—" Alara started to ask, but trailed off when she saw Jonah's expression. The storm outside intensified as night fell, rain lashing against the windows in waves. Jonah had given Alara some spare clothes that had belonged to Ava. They were a bit big, but better than her wet ones. She dozed on and off, still weak from her ordeal. Once he was sure she was sleeping soundly, Jonah returned to his computer desk. The wildlife cameras would have captured more footage, maybe something to explain how she ended up alone in his woods. He plugged in his headphones and began reviewing the files. The night vision footage was clear enough, showing Nathan leading Alara to the campsite. Jonah's jaw clenched as he watched the man's calculated movements, the way he kept Alara distracted until she fell asleep. Then came the moment Nathan packed up the SUV, pausing only to look back at the tent where his daughter slept. "You're a burden, Alara." Nathan's cold voice came through the headphones. "I need to move on." Jonah's hands gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. The casual cruelty in those words, the deliberate abandonment of a child. His mind flashed to Ava, to all the times she'd talked about wanting to help people like Alara. How proud she'd been of her designs, her dreams of making the world better. With controlled movements, Jonah saved the video file to a secure folder. Behind him, Alara shifted in her sleep, making a small sound of distress. Rusty immediately moved closer to her, offering silent comfort. The rain continued to pour outside, but inside the cabin something had changed. The careful isolation Jonah had built around himself had cracked, letting in something he'd thought he'd left behind years ago: responsibility for another person's welfare. The next day, morning light filtered through the cabin windows, the storm's fury replaced by a gentle dripping from the trees outside. The air smelled fresh and clean, that distinct after-rain scent mixing with the aroma of cooking oatmeal. Jonah stood at his small wood-burning stove, stirring the pot with mechanical precision. Years of living alone had turned his morning routine into something almost meditative. Behind him, the soft scratching of pencil on paper caught his attention. Alara sat in her wheelchair at the rough-hewn table, her sketchbook propped against its edge. Rusty lay at her feet, his head tilted slightly as if posing. The dog seemed to understand the importance of staying still while Alara captured his likeness. Jonah watched from the corner of his eye as Alara's hand moved across the page with surprising skill. Her strokes were confident, capturing Rusty's gentle eyes and the slight gray around his muzzle. She had an artist's eye for detail. The way she noticed the slight favor Rusty gave his bad hip, the subtle droop to one of his ears. The silence between them wasn't exactly uncomfortable, but it carried weight. Jonah could feel questions hanging in the air, see them in the way Alara's eyes occasionally darted toward him before returning to her drawing. He focused on portioning out the oatmeal, adding dried berries from last summer's harvest. "Here," he said, placing a bowl in front of her. His voice still felt rough from disuse, despite the previous day's interactions. Alara set down her pencil and nodded in thanks. She studied the oatmeal for a moment before taking a small bite. "It's good," she said quietly, surprise evident in her tone. Jonah grunted in acknowledgement and sat down with his own bowl. Rusty shifted position, moving to lie between them as if trying to bridge the gap of uncertainty that stretched across the table. They ate in silence until Alara suddenly set down her spoon. Her fingers twisted in her lap as she gathered courage. Why did my dad leave me? The question hung in the air like smoke. Jonah's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, buying time as he wrestled with what he knew. The cruel words from the video footage echoed in his mind, but looking at Alara's face, so young, so vulnerable, he couldn't bring himself to deliver that particular truth. "Found you alone," he said finally, his words careful and measured. "By the creek. You were barely breathing." He paused, watching her process this information. Don't know what happened before that. It wasn't a lie, but the omission sat heavy in his chest. Alara's face fell slightly, though she tried to hide it by returning to her oatmeal. Jonah recognized the look. It was the same one Ava used to wear when trying to be brave through disappointment. Later that morning, after the dishes were cleaned and put away, Jonah decided to show Alara around the cabin's exterior. He helped her navigate her wheelchair down the gently sloping ramp he'd built years ago for moving heavy equipment. "Solar panels," he explained, pointing to the array on the south-facing roof. "Power the whole place." He moved them along the path, indicating various aspects of his self-sufficient setup. "Rain collection system there filters the water." Alara absorbed everything with keen interest, her eyes bright with curiosity. She asked intelligent questions about the water filtration process and the battery storage system for the solar power. Jonah found himself explaining more than he had intended, drawn in by her genuine interest. They reached his workshop, a lean-to addition to the main cabin. Tools hung in neat rows on the walls, and various mechanical projects sat in various stages of completion on the workbenches. Alara's attention immediately fixed on a shelf holding what appeared to be mechanical joint components and partial exoskeleton frames. "What are those for?" she asked, pointing to the shelf. Jonah's chest tightened. Those were Ava's projects, her dreams of helping people with mobility issues. He'd kept them, unable to part with them, but equally unable to continue her work. "Just old projects," he said gruffly, turning away. "Nothing important." Alara's eyes lingered on the shelf, but she didn't press further. Something in Jonah's tone must have warned her off. Instead, she asked about the solar-powered generator humming quietly in the corner. The rest of the day passed in similar fashion, Alara exploring what she could reach, Jonah answering questions when necessary, but maintaining careful distance. He showed her his small greenhouse, explaining how he grew vegetables year-round. She seemed particularly fascinated by the automated watering system he'd rigged up. As night fell, Jonah sat at his computer desk, the soft glow of the monitor illuminating his troubled face. He replayed the footage again, this time focusing on Nathan's expressions. The calculated calm, the practiced movements, the complete lack of remorse. It all spoke of premeditation. This wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a planned abandonment. Jonah downloaded the clip to a backup drive, his jaw clenched tight. His eyes drifted to Ava's photo on the wall. She smiled back at him, forever frozen in that moment of pride over her latest invention. He remembered how she used to talk about helping kids like Alara, about making mobility assistance accessible to everyone. From the main room came a whisper, so soft he almost missed it. "I don't think he's coming back." Alara's words carried no tears, just a quiet acceptance that struck deeper than any crying could have. Jonah's hand tightened around the backup drive, but he remained silent. In the darkness of his workshop, surrounded by the ghosts of his daughter's dreams and the evidence of another father's betrayal, he had no words of comfort to offer. The next day, the morning sun streamed through the workshop windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air. Jonah stood in the doorway, watching as Alara wheeled herself around the cramped space, her eyes wide with curiosity. The workshop was his sanctuary, a place he'd barely shared with anyone since Ava's death. But something about Alara's genuine interest made him want to open this door. "This is where I fix things," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Or try to, anyway. Ilara's wheelchair moved carefully between workbenches cluttered with tools and half-finished projects. She stopped at a wall that caught her attention. It was covered in what looked like mechanical limbs, circuit boards with trailing wires, and various robotic components in different stages of completion. Above them all, mounted on a high shelf, sat a wheelchair, unlike any she'd ever seen. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the chair. It was sleeker than her current one, with what appeared to be motorized joints and sophisticated electronics built into its frame. Jonah's throat tightened. That was one of Ava's projects. She wanted to make better chairs, ones that could handle rough terrain. Ava? Ilara's eyes moved to a framed photo on the wall. The same girl she'd noticed earlier. "My daughter," Jonah said quietly. He moved to a workbench and began organizing tools, more to keep his hands busy than from any real need. "She was good with machines, better than me." Ilara wheeled herself to a large metal cabinet, its drawers labeled with neat handwriting. One drawer caught her eye. Project notes and designs. She pulled it open before Jonah could stop her. Inside were several worn notebooks, their pages dog-eared and filled with diagrams, mathematical equations, and lines of computer code. Some had colorful sticky notes poking out. Others had sketches spilling onto their covers. Ilara picked one up, handling it with careful reverence. "Wait," Jonah started, reaching for the journal, but Ilara had already opened it. "Day 47 of Project Skywalker," she read aloud. "The servos aren't responding fast enough to the neural interface. Maybe if I adjust the response time." She looked up at Jonah with bright eyes. She was trying to make legs move by thinking about it? Jonah nodded stiffly. She wanted to help people walk again, said technology should work for people, not the other way around. Ilara flipped through more pages, taking in the detailed drawings and enthusiastic notes. "She sounds like someone I'd want to be friends with," she said softly. When Jonah reached for the journal again, Ilara pulled it closer to her chest. "Please," she said, "can I read more? I understand a lot of this. I like building things too." Jonah's hands fell to his sides. He looked at Ilara, really looked at her, and saw something of Ava in the way she clutched the journal, in the eager intelligence behind her eyes. After a long moment, he nodded. They spent the next few hours poring over Ava's notes together. Ilara asked questions about circuits and programming that surprised Jonah with their insight. When they came across designs for a small drone meant to assist with mobility exercises, Ilara's face lit up. "We could build this," she said, pointing to the diagram. "Look, you have most of these parts right here." Jonah hesitated, but Ilara was already wheeling herself to the shelves, pointing out components they could use. The propeller assembly there, that circuit board, those motors. Before he knew it, Jonah found himself clearing a workbench. They laid out parts according to Ava's diagrams, with Ilara suggesting modifications based on the available materials. Her small hands moved confidently among the components, arranging them in logical order. "The power distribution needs to be balanced," she explained, sketching a quick modification on a blank page. "See? If we move the battery here instead?" Jonah found himself nodding along, impressed by her understanding. When it came time to solder the first connections, he started to do it himself. But Ilara spoke up. "Could I try?" she asked. "I've watched lots of videos about it." After a moment's consideration, Jonah pulled up a chair beside her. He showed her how to hold the soldering iron safely, how to feed the solder at just the right angle. Her face scrunched in concentration as she made her first connection. "Perfect," Jonah said, surprised to hear the warmth in his own voice. He realized he was smiling, actually smiling, for the first time in what felt like years. They worked through the afternoon, Ilara reading instructions from Ava's journal, while Jonah helped with the more complicated assembly. The drone took shape under their hands, not exactly like Ava's design, but something uniquely theirs. When Ilara suggested adding LED lights for style, Jonah found himself agreeing. As the day's light began to fade, they finished the final connections. The drone sat on the workbench, its fresh soldering joints still cooling, lights blinking in a steady pattern. "Ready?" Jonah asked, holding the simple remote control they'd cobbled together. Ilara nodded eagerly. They had cleared a space in the middle of the workshop for the test flight. Jonah pressed the power button, and the drone's rotors began to spin. Slowly, the little machine lifted off the ground. It hovered unsteadily for a few seconds, drifting slightly to the left before suddenly spinning and crashing into a stack of empty boxes. The workshop fell silent for a moment. Then Ilara burst out laughing, a bright, genuine sound that seemed to chase away the workshop's shadows. The sound startled both of them, but Ilara couldn't stop. She laughed until tears came to her eyes, pointing at the drone's crooked antenna. Jonah watched her, something in his chest loosening at the sound of her joy. He looked at the photo of Ava on the wall, then back at Ilara, who was still giggling as she retrieved the fallen drone. "Ava would have liked you," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Days later, the morning air was crisp and clean as Ilara wheeled herself onto the cabin's wooden porch. She found Jonah in the clearing, hammering a large wooden post into the ground. Next to him lay a collection of items she didn't recognize at first: curved pieces of wood, string, and what looked like arrows with blunted tips. "What's all this?" she asked, carefully navigating her wheelchair down the ramp Jonah had built yesterday. Jonah turned, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Archery setup. Figure it's time you learn how to handle yourself." He paused, then added quietly, "Just in case." Ilara's eyes widened. "You're going to teach me to shoot?" "Among other things." Jonah finished securing the target, a hay bale with a painted circle, and walked over to pick up one of the bows. It was smaller than the others, clearly meant for someone her size. "This was Ava's first bow, should work for you." He showed her how to hold it properly, adjusting her grip several times. Ilara's enthusiasm quickly met reality as she struggled to pull back the bowstring. Her arms shook with the effort, and her first arrow fell pathetically short of the target. "Again," Jonah said simply, handing her another arrow. They spent the next hour working on her form. Ilara's determination showed in her furrowed brow and the way she refused to complain about her aching arms. By the end of the session, she'd managed to hit the hay bale twice. Not near the target, but Jonah nodded approvingly anyway. "Not bad for a start," he said, collecting the scattered arrows. "But archery's just one skill. Come on." He led her to a shaded area where he'd set up a makeshift classroom. A flat stump served as a table, displaying various ropes, a small knife in its sheath, and an array of local plants. "First knots," Jonah announced, picking up a length of rope. His large hands moved with surprising grace as he demonstrated a simple figure-8 knot. "This one could save your life someday." Ilara proved to be a quick study with the knots. Her fingers, though small, were nimble and precise. She approached each new knot like a puzzle to be solved, her face lighting up when she figured out the patterns. "It's like programming," she said, successfully completing a bowline knot. "Just with rope instead of code." Jonah's eyebrows raised slightly at the comparison. "Huh, never thought of it that way." The knife safety lesson was next. Jonah was especially careful here, showing her proper handling techniques and basic rules. "Always cut away from yourself," he emphasized, watching her practice whittling a stick. "Respect the blade, but don't fear it." When they moved on to plant identification, Ilara surprised him again. She created a mental categorization system on the spot, grouping plants by leaf patterns and growth habits. "Like sorting variables," she explained, then caught herself. "That's a computer thing." "Ava used to do that too," Jonah said softly. "Make connections between nature and machines." They broke for lunch on the porch, sharing sandwiches and water while Rusty dozed at their feet. Ilara watched Jonah carefully, gathering courage for the question she'd been holding back. "Could you tell me more about Ava?" she finally asked. "About what she liked to do?" Jonah was quiet for so long that Ilara thought he wouldn't answer. But then he set down his sandwich and looked out at the trees. "She loved building things," he said, his voice rough with memory. "Especially robots, but not the kind you see in movies. She wanted to make machines that helped people move better, live better." He glanced at Ilara's wheelchair. She spent hours in that workshop testing different motors and control systems. said she wanted to revolutionize mobility assistance. Ilara leaned forward slightly. Was she good at it? A sad smile crossed Jonah's face. Better than good. She won regional competitions, got invited to national events. She was working on neural interface systems when... He stopped, his hands clenching slightly. When what? Ilara asked softly. Jonah took a deep breath. When we had the accident, we were running late for a robotics competition. I was driving too fast, trying to make up time. The road was wet. He shook his head. She didn't make it. Silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of wind in the trees and Rusty's gentle snoring. Ilara watched Jonah's face, seeing the pain he usually kept hidden. I'm sorry, she said simply. Jonah nodded once, sharply, and stood up to clear their plates. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, with more practice in basic survival skills. Ilara's determination never wavered, even when her arms trembled from drawing the bow or her fingers fumbled with complex knots. As evening approached, Jonah went to check his security cameras, leaving Ilara alone in the workshop. She wheeled herself slowly around the familiar space, stopping at the shelf where Ava's prototype wheelchair sat. In the dying light, she could see details she'd missed before: the innovative joint design, the careful cable routing, the custom control interface. Her hand reached out to touch the controls gently, fingers tracing the smooth surface. The chair represented something unfinished, a dream interrupted. But maybe we can finish it together, she said quietly to the empty room. Unknown to her, Jonah stood in the doorway, watching. His eyes glistened in the dim light as he observed this girl, so different from Ava, yet sharing that same spark of determination and creativity, reach out to his daughter's final project. He remained silent, letting the moment stretch, feeling something shift in his heart like ice beginning to thaw. The next morning brought a new energy to the cabin. Jonah pulled out boxes of old electronics and mechanical parts he'd been storing, spreading them across the workshop table. Ilara's eyes lit up at the treasure trove of components. Circuit boards, motors, sensors, and countless mysterious gadgets she couldn't wait to explore. First, Jonah said, carefully lifting Ava's prototype wheelchair from its shelf, we need to assess what we've got. He set it on the workbench, pulling out a worn notebook filled with Ava's neat handwriting and detailed diagrams. Ilara wheeled closer, examining the chair's innovative design. The frame was lightweight but sturdy, with cleverly placed joints that could adapt to different terrain. The control system was unlike anything she'd seen before, a blend of manual and automated assistance. Ava called it the Smart Chair, Jonah explained, his voice soft with memory. She wanted it to learn from the user's movements, anticipate needs. He ran a hand along the frame. We'll need to replace these servos, and the control board is probably shot after all these years. They developed a routine over the next few days. Mornings were dedicated to the workshop, where they carefully dismantled and cleaned each component of Ava's chair. Jonah taught Ilara about electrical systems, mechanical linkages, and the basics of robotics. She absorbed everything eagerly, her quick mind making connections that sometimes surprised even Jonah. When parts were missing or broken, they'd drive out to local scrap sites Jonah knew about. These excursions became treasure hunts, with Ilara spotting useful components in the most unlikely places. An old electric scooter yielded perfect motors. A discarded laptop provided a serviceable processor. Look, Ilara called out one morning, pointing to something glinting in a pile of electronics. That's a gyroscope from a gaming controller. We could use it for balance correction. Jonah smiled, remembering how Ava used to get excited about similar finds. Good eye, kid. Afternoons were still dedicated to survival training. Ilara's archery improved steadily, and she could now identify edible plants without hesitation. But it was the mechanical skills that truly captured her interest, especially when Jonah showed her how to repurpose materials for mobility aids. See this ATV frame? He demonstrated, cutting away sections of lightweight tubing. With the right modifications, it can become a support structure. He worked methodically, adding elastic bands and padding from old camping gear. When the makeshift braces were ready, Jonah helped Alara attach them to her legs. "Go slow," he cautioned, positioning himself to spot her. "Let the elastics do most of the work." Alara gripped the parallel bars they'd constructed from pipes. Her arms trembled as she pulled herself up, the braces creaking slightly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, gradually, she felt her weight shift onto her feet. She was standing. Tears welled up in her eyes, not from pain or strain, but from pure disbelief. For those few precious seconds, she was upright, looking at the world from a height she'd almost forgotten existed. "I'm doing it," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm actually standing." Jonah's steady hands remained ready to catch her, but his own eyes were suspiciously bright. "You sure are, kid." Later that afternoon, they decided to test the repaired drone again. Alara had spent hours refining the control system, using principles from Ava's notes. The small aircraft sat in the clearing, its new parts gleaming in the sunlight. "Systems check," Alara announced, running through the startup sequence they'd practiced. The drone's rotors spun to life, creating a gentle hum. This time, when it lifted off, it didn't crash. Instead, it rose steadily into the air, hovering perfectly in place. Alara's face broke into a huge grin as she guided it through basic maneuvers. "We did it," she exclaimed, carefully landing the drone. "Ava's design works." What neither of them knew was that the drone's reactivated signal had been picked up by a passing weather research satellite. The data packet, containing the drone's original registration information, was automatically logged by a university server hundreds of miles away. As evening approached, they sat down to their usual sunset meal on the porch. Rusty lay at their feet, occasionally lifting his head hopefully when food was mentioned. The day's successes had created a warm atmosphere of accomplishment and possibility. After dinner, they moved inside where Jonah had built a fire to ward off the growing autumn chill. Alara sat in her chair near the hearth, watching the flames dance while Jonah carved something small from a piece of wood. The question that had been building in her mind all day finally found its way out. "If you were my dad," she asked quietly, "would you have left me?" Jonah's hands stilled on the carving. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then, without a word, he held out what he'd been working on. A small wooden bird, its wings spread as if in flight. "Ava made one just like this," he said, placing it in Alara's palm. It was her first carving. His voice was rough with emotion as he finally answered her question. "Not in a million years." Meanwhile, in a dimly lit university office hundreds of miles away, a grad student working the night shift stifled a yawn as she monitored incoming satellite data. A notification popped up on her screen, an irregular signal from an unregistered location. Curious, she dug deeper into the data. The drone's registration number led her to an old database entry, "Property of Ava Reed." Following protocol, she forwarded the information to the appropriate channels, where it was automatically filed under a long-forgotten case folder labeled "Missing Child Jonah Reed." Back in the cabin, Alara held the wooden bird carefully, running her fingers over its smooth surface. The firelight caught the grain of the wood, making it seem almost alive. She looked up at Jonah, who was adding another log to the fire, and felt something shift in her heart, a feeling of safety she thought she'd lost forever. The next day, the morning sun filtered through the trees as Jonah and Alara made their way to a mossy clearing near the cabin. The newly modified wheelchair gleamed with its fresh components: terrain-adaptive wheels, smart suspension, and a control system that learned from Alara's movements. Weeks of work had transformed Ava's prototype into something uniquely suited for Alara. "Ready for the full test?" Jonah asked, double-checking the safety harness they'd installed. Alara nodded eagerly, her hands positioned on the redesigned controls. The chair hummed to life, sensors activating as they scanned the ground ahead. She started slowly, testing the basic movements they'd practiced in the workshop. The chair responded beautifully, gliding over small obstacles that would have stopped her old wheelchair. When she encountered a fallen log, the smart suspension automatically adjusted, lifting slightly to clear it. Alara's face broke into a wide smile as she picked up speed, weaving between trees with growing confidence. "This is amazing," she called out, executing a perfect turn around a large boulder. The chair's wheels gripped the uneven ground, maintaining stability even as she pushed it faster. Jonah watched with pride, noting how naturally she handled the controls. He'd seen that same look of joy on Ava's face when she'd successfully tested new designs. The drone buzzed overhead, recording Alara's progress as she navigated increasingly challenging terrain. "Let's try the steep section," Alara suggested, pointing to a gentle slope covered in pine needles. This would be the real test, the kind of terrain that had defeated her old chair in the forest. The chair's sensors mapped the incline, adjusting power distribution to each wheel. Alara moved forward confidently, and the chair responded perfectly, maintaining its balance as it climbed. At the top, she turned around and carefully descended, the automatic braking system keeping her speed steady. "Got all that?" she called to the drone, which hovered nearby, capturing every moment. Jonah gave her a thumbs up, checking the footage on his tablet. They spent the next hour putting the chair through its paces, testing every feature they'd built in. Alara handled each challenge with growing skill, her movements becoming more fluid and natural. The drone faithfully recorded it all, creating a detailed log of her progress. Later that afternoon, Jonah prepared for his regular hunting trip. "I'll be back before sunset," he said, shouldering his rifle. "There's stew warming on the stove if you get hungry." Alara waved goodbye from the workshop where she'd been organizing their tools. Once Jonah disappeared into the trees, she felt drawn to explore deeper into the cluttered space. They'd been so focused on the wheelchair project, she hadn't really looked through the older equipment. In a corner cabinet behind some spare parts, she found a small external hard drive. The label caught her eye. Forest Cam Footage, July 10th. The date seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Curious, she grabbed Jonah's tablet from the workbench and plugged in the drive. The video file loaded automatically. Alara's heart stopped as the nighttime forest scene appeared on screen. There was her father's SUV, parked at the edge of the trees. She watched, unable to look away, as Nathan methodically packed his things back into the vehicle. The camera's microphone picked up his cold, clear voice. "You're a burden, Alara. I need to move on." The words hit her like physical blows. The footage continued, showing Nathan driving away, leaving her sleeping form alone in the tent. She didn't hear Jonah return, didn't notice him standing in the workshop doorway, his face heavy with regret as he saw what she was watching. Only when the video ended did she become aware of his presence. Tears streamed down her face as she turned to look at him. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You knew?" Jonah set his rifle down carefully, moving slowly into the room. "I found the footage the morning I found you," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. I didn't know how to tell you. Didn't want to cause you more pain." Alara's fingers traced the edge of the tablet screen, her face unnaturally calm despite the tears. There was no anger in her expression, no accusation, just a deep, quiet hurt that seemed to fill the room. "Can I be alone now?" she asked softly, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the workshop walls. Jonah nodded, backing away slowly. "I'll be outside if you need me," he said. But Alara had already turned away, her shoulders rigid with contained emotion. The evening settled over the forest like a heavy blanket. Jonah sat on the cabin's front steps, watching fireflies dance in the growing darkness. The weight of his decision to keep the truth from Alara pressed down on him. He understood her need for solitude. Hadn't he sought the same after losing Ava? Inside the workshop, Alara sat motionless in her chair, the tablet's screen long since gone dark. With mechanical precision, she plugged the drone's SD card into the tablet. Her fingers moved steadily as she transferred the video file, each click of the touchscreen echoing in the quiet room. Miles away in a bustling newsroom, a journalist named Sarah Chen was preparing to leave for the day when her computer chimed with a new email. The subject line made her pause. She was left behind. The sender was anonymous, but something about the message's urgency made her open the attachment. Back in the cabin, Alara sat in the darkness, the drone's SD card clutched in her hand. The truth she'd suspected but never wanted to believe was now preserved in cold, digital clarity. The father who had shaped her world had also chosen to destroy it, and she had watched it happen through the unblinking eye of a Forrest camera. The morning news cycle erupted with an intensity that caught everyone off guard. The footage of Nathan Wren abandoning his disabled daughter in the forest spread across social media platforms with devastating speed. Sarah Chen's initial article, posted at midnight, was sparse and factual. Tech CEO Nathan Wren caught on camera abandoning disabled daughter in remote forest. The raw footage spoke for itself. Millions watched as Nathan methodically packed his SUV, his cold words echoing through countless shares and reposts. "You're a burden, Alara. I need to move on." The timestamp and metadata were clear, showing the exact date and GPS coordinates. By dawn, #JusticeForAlara was trending nationwide. Social media exploded with outrage and calls for investigation. People shared their own stories of parental abandonment, creating a wave of solidarity under #AbandonedNotBroken. Digital forensics experts quickly verified the footage's authenticity, shutting down early claims of manipulation. The stock price of Nathan's company plunged as investors reacted to the scandal. Corporate partners began distancing themselves, releasing carefully worded statements about reviewing their relationships with Wren Technologies. Marissa, Nathan's fiancée, deleted her social media accounts as comments flooded her latest posts. Nathan called an emergency press conference at Wren Technologies headquarters. He stood before a forest of microphones, his usual polished appearance showing signs of strain. His voice cracked with what seemed like emotion as he addressed the cameras. "My beloved daughter Alara was kidnapped from our camping trip 2 months ago," he declared, dabbing at his eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "This video is a cruel manipulation, likely created by AI technology to destroy my reputation and hurt our family during this terrible time." His legal team distributed press packets claiming the footage had been digitally altered. They threatened lawsuits against anyone who shared or reported on the fraudulent content. Behind the scenes, Nathan's crisis management team worked frantically to contain the damage, sending cease and desist letters to major news outlets. Meanwhile, in the forest cabin, Jonah first noticed something was wrong when he heard the distant buzz of drones. He was outside checking the solar panels when 3 different unmanned aircraft passed overhead within an hour. They weren't his wildlife monitoring drones. These were sleek, professional models equipped with high-resolution cameras. He rushed inside to find Alara at her workbench, calmly adjusting the suspension on her modified wheelchair. "We've got company up there," he said, pointing to the ceiling. "Professional drones. Someone's looking for us." Alara didn't look up from her work. "I know," she said quietly. "I uploaded the footage last night." Jonah froze. "You what?" "I sent the video to a journalist," Alara continued, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. "The one of my father leaving me here. People needed to know the truth." Jonah ran his fingers through his beard, pacing the workshop. He wasn't angry at her decision. He understood the need for truth better than most. But fear gripped his chest as he thought about the consequences. "They'll come for you now," he warned, checking the cabin's security feeds on his tablet. "Your father, the authorities, the media, they'll all be heading this way. We're not hidden anymore." Alara finally looked up from her work, her eyes clear and determined. "Good," she said firmly. "Let them come. I'm not hiding anymore." Jonah wanted to argue, to explain the dangers of exposure, but he recognized the resolve in her expression. It was the same look Ava had worn when standing up to bullies who mocked her robotics projects. Instead, he began preparing for the inevitable. They spent the afternoon securing the cabin. Jonah backed up all their project data, especially the wheelchair designs. He showed Alara the root cellar, hidden beneath a trapdoor in the pantry, and stocked it with emergency supplies. They moved Ava's most precious belongings, her journals, prototypes, and photos, to a secure location. As the sun began to set, Jonah's motion sensors lit up with multiple alerts. 2 black SUVs were moving through the forest, following the old logging road that led to the cabin. Their headlights were off, but thermal imaging showed 8 people inside, all armed. "Time to go," Jonah said quietly, helping Alara out of her wheelchair. She didn't protest as he carried her down to the root cellar. The space was small but secure, lined with concrete and stocked with enough supplies for several days. "Whatever happens, stay quiet," he instructed, handing her a satellite phone. "If I'm not back in 3 hours, call this number. It's an old friend who can help." Alara grabbed his hand before he could close the trapdoor. "Be careful," she whispered. "You're the only real father I've ever had." Jonah squeezed her hand, then carefully sealed the cellar. He moved Alara's wheelchair to his bedroom, making it look like she might be sleeping there. Then he positioned himself in the main room, shotgun across his lap. He had no intention of using it. Violence would only make things worse, but it might buy them some time. Through the cabin's windows, he watched the armed agents spread out in a standard search pattern. They wore tactical gear, but no official insignias. Private security, then. Probably hired by Nathan to handle this quietly. Their weapons were real enough, though, and their movements showed professional training. Jonah took a deep breath, remembering his combat medic days. He didn't need to win this confrontation. He just needed to stall, to keep them talking and searching long enough for his backup plan to activate. The first agent reached the front porch and Jonah heard the creak of boots on wood. A sharp knock echoed through the cabin. "Mr. Reed?" a voice called out. "We need to speak with you about Alara Wren." Jonah gripped his shotgun tighter, not to shoot but to steady his nerves. He had protected Alara this far. He wouldn't stop now. "I'm armed," he called back clearly. "Let's talk about this civilized-like—" The agents tensed visibly at his words, but none of them raised their weapons. They were under orders to handle this without violence. Nathan wouldn't want that kind of publicity. Jonah allowed himself a grim smile. That gave him leverage, and he intended to use every second of it. The cabin door burst open with a thunderous crack, sending splinters of wood flying across the room. Armed men in tactical gear poured through the entrance, weapons raised. Jonah remained seated, his shotgun carefully placed on the floor beside him, hands raised in a gesture of compliance. "I assume you have a warrant?" Jonah's voice was steady, betraying none of the fear churning in his gut. The agents exchanged glances, their formation tightening around him. A new figure stepped through the doorway, a man in an expensive charcoal suit and dark sunglasses, looking comically out of place in the rustic cabin. "We're here under emergency jurisdiction," the suit announced, his tone clipped and rehearsed. "The child, Alara Wren, was kidnapped. This is a rescue operation." Jonah's jaw clenched. "Rescue? From what? The father who abandoned her in the woods to die?" "Search the premises," the suit ordered, ignoring Jonah's words. The agents moved efficiently through the cabin, their boots heavy on the wooden floors. It took them less than 5 minutes to find the root cellar. The trap door creaked open, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness below. Alara sat in the corner, her face set in determined defiance. "I'm not going anywhere," she declared, her voice stronger than her small frame suggested. "Jonah saved my life. My father left me to die." The suit descended the ladder, producing a small case from his jacket pocket. "Miss Wren, you're in shock. We need to get you proper medical attention." "No!" Alara tried to push herself away, but in the confined space, she had nowhere to go. "I don't need—" The suit nodded to one of the agents, who produced a syringe. "This is just to help you stay calm," he said soothingly, but his eyes were cold behind his glasses. "Medical necessity. Standard procedure." Jonah struggled against the agents holding him, his voice raw with anger. "She doesn't need sedation. She's perfectly fine. You have no right—" But they weren't listening. The needle went in, and Alara's eyes widened in betrayal before slowly growing heavy. Her last conscious sight was Jonah being forced into handcuffs, his face twisted in helpless rage. When Alara next opened her eyes, she found herself in a stark white room that smelled of antiseptic. The walls were bare except for a generic landscape painting, and fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Her modified wheelchair was gone, replaced by a standard hospital model that felt clunky and restrictive after Jonah's improvements. A nurse with kind eyes but nervous hands checked her vitals. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Alara didn't answer. She scanned the room, noting the absence of her sketchbook, her tools, all the pieces of her life from the cabin. The nurse chatted about the facility, a temporary child services center. But Alara barely heard her through the fog of sedatives still clouding her mind. Over the next few days, various staff members visited her room. They were uniformly gentle and careful with their words, but Alara could sense the script behind their interactions. Nobody mentioned Jonah or the cabin. Nobody acknowledged the viral video of her father. Instead, they spoke of her upcoming placement with a qualified family. That family arrived on a sunny Thursday morning. The Harrises, James and Patricia, were textbook perfect, well-dressed, well-spoken, with practiced smiles and manicured appearances. They brought flowers and a new tablet to replace the one you lost, dear. Alara recognized Patricia from one of Nathan's corporate events. She worked for the PR firm that handled his company's image. This wasn't a coincidence. This was damage control. Cameras flashed as the Harrises wheeled her out of the facility. Local news crews captured the heartwarming story of a generous couple opening their home to the recovered daughter of tech CEO Nathan Wren. Patricia's hand on Alara's shoulder felt like a brand. Their house was a modernist mansion with wide halls and smooth floors, perfectly accessible, as Patricia kept pointing out. But Alara's room felt like a showroom, decorated in pastels and inspirational quotes. Everything was new, chosen for its photogenic quality rather than practical use. The Harrises treated her like a promotional campaign. They arranged interviews with sympathetic reporters, posted carefully staged photos on social media, and scheduled appearances at charity events. Each time, the story was the same: a tragic misunderstanding, a grateful child, a generous family stepping in to help. At night, alone in her too-perfect room, Alara hid under her blankets with a small flashlight. She whispered to herself, reciting the survival skills Jonah had taught her, keeping her mind sharp despite the fog of mild sedatives they still insisted she needed to sleep. During one of these late-night sessions, her hand brushed against something in the lining of the exosuit brace she'd been wearing when they took her from the cabin. It was small and hard, a GPS chip, carefully sewn into the fabric. Jonah must have added it without telling her, a silent safeguard. Alara's eyes lit up with newfound determination. She wasn't alone. She wasn't powerless. She just needed to be patient and think like Jonah had taught her. Miles away in a remote county jail, Jonah sat in a holding cell. His beard was unkempt, his clothes still dirty from the cabin, but his eyes remained alert. They'd charged him with kidnapping, but something about the process felt off. Too quick, too quiet, too neat. "I think you're not the villain here, Mr. Reed." The voice came from the hallway outside his cell. Jonah looked up to see a woman in a sharp blazer, her badge identifying her as Detective Raya Lynn. She stood with quiet confidence, studying him with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Detective Raya Lynn settled into the metal chair across from Jonah in the holding room, her movements deliberate and controlled. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the table between them. She placed a thick manila folder on the scratched surface, spreading out its contents with methodical precision. "Your daughter was brilliant," Raya said, sliding over a printed web page. Ava's robotics blog had quite a following in the engineering community. Her work on adaptive mobility solutions was years ahead of its time. Jonah's hands trembled slightly as he touched the familiar layout of Ava's website. Her cheerful profile picture smiled up at him from the corner of the screen. "And this," Raya continued, laying out more papers, "is from Alara's journal. The similarities in their thinking patterns are remarkable." She pointed to sketches of mechanical joints and control systems, annotations scattered in the margins. Both of them saw problems as puzzles to be solved, not limitations to accept. Jonah's eyes narrowed. "How did you get these?" "I have my sources." Raya's expression remained neutral, but her eyes held a sharp intelligence. "Just like I have the timestamps and metadata from your forest cameras. But that's not what interests me most." She pulled out another file, this one marked with red tabs. "What interests me is Nathan Wren's pattern of convenient accidents." She spread out newspaper clippings and police reports. His first wife, Margaret Wren, died 3 years ago. Car crash, brake failure. The investigation was rushed, the evidence processed quickly, too quickly. Insurance paid out within days. Raya leaned forward. And now his daughter, who he claimed was kidnapped by mountain hikers, shows up abandoned in your woods. He left her to die, Jonah growled, his fists clenching. Yes, he did. Raya's voice was soft but firm. And that footage you captured gave me the leverage I needed. I've been building an unofficial case against Nathan for months, but I couldn't move without concrete evidence. Now I have it. She pulled out a single photograph. Nathan standing over Margaret's crashed car, his face carefully arranged in an expression of grief while he spoke on his phone. Notice his hand position? He's not calling emergency services. According to phone records, he's calling his lawyer, before checking if his wife was alive. Jonah studied the image, his jaw tight. Why are you showing me all this? Raya glanced at the security camera in the corner, then reached into her jacket pocket. She produced what looked like an ordinary ballpoint pen. Because I need your help, and you need mine. She placed the pen precisely in front of him. This has a hidden SIM chip inside. You can send one message to one person you trust completely. Choose wisely. Jonah picked up the pen, feeling its weight. His mind immediately went to Professor Chen, Ava's old robotics mentor. The man had been like a grandfather to her, encouraging her innovations while tempering her enthusiasm with practical guidance. Across town, in a sleek studio setup, Alara sat in her standard wheelchair under bright lights. Cameras pointed at her from multiple angles while Patricia Harris, her foster mother, hovered nearby with a makeup artist. "Remember, sweetheart," Patricia said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Just stick to the talking points we practiced. Your father loves you. There was a terrible misunderstanding, and you're so grateful for a fresh start with us." Alara stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. When the red lights blinked on and the interviewer began asking questions, she remained silent. The interviewer tried different approaches, sympathetic, encouraging, even slightly challenging, but Alara's lips stayed sealed. After 10 minutes of unusable footage, the director called cut. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, Patricia's facade cracked. She grabbed Alara's wheelchair handles, her manicured nails digging into the rubber grips. "Do as you're told," she hissed through clenched teeth. "We didn't take you in out of charity. You have a role to play." While Patricia berated her, Alara's hand slipped beneath her leg brace. Her fingers found the small button Jonah had installed in the GPS chip. She pressed it 3 times. Activated. Back in the holding room, Jonah carefully wrote his message to Professor Chen using the special pen. The old man would understand the coded references to Ava's projects, would know how to contact the right people quietly. Raya watched him write, then took the pen back. "I'll have you released into my supervision within the hour. The charges were rushed, the paperwork sloppy. It won't hold up to real scrutiny." True to her word, Jonah was walking free less than an hour later. They drove to his cabin in Raya's unmarked car, the detective explaining her investigation along the way. When they arrived, Jonah's heart sank. The cabin had been ransacked. Papers scattered everywhere, furniture overturned, equipment smashed. Nathan's men had been thorough in their search for anything incriminating. But they hadn't found everything. Jonah went straight to a loose floorboard under his workbench. Hidden beneath it was the prototype exosuit he and Alara had been working on, the one she'd cleverly hidden a backup GPS chip in during their last project session. His hand shook as he connected the chip to his tablet. A map appeared, showing a blinking dot moving through the city streets. Alara's position, tracked in real time. "She's in a black van," Raya said, looking at her phone. "My contact at traffic control confirms it's registered to one of Nathan's shell companies." Jonah turned to her, his eyes burning with determination. "We're getting her back." The city lights twinkled like distant stars as Jonah and Detective Raya sat in her unmarked sedan, parked in the shadow of an abandoned warehouse. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. Spread across their laps in the center console were architectural blueprints, their edges worn and creased. "The building used to be a tech startup hub," Raya explained, tracing her finger along a service corridor. Nathan's company bought it through a subsidiary last year. On paper, it's listed as a media production facility, but my sources say it's more of a private safe house. Jonah studied the floor plans intently, his weathered hands smoothing out the wrinkles. 5 stories, multiple exits, keycard access on all doors. He pointed to a section marked mechanical. What's this area? Maintenance hub. Houses the building's core systems, HVAC, electrical, server room. Raya pulled out her tablet, showing security camera feeds she'd managed to access. They're keeping Alara on the 3rd floor, East Wing. The Harris couple has the suite next door. These foster parents, Jonah growled. What's their real connection to Nathan? Raya's fingers flew across her tablet, pulling up financial records. Patricia and James Harris are part of a larger network. I've traced payments from Nathan's shell companies to dozens of similar couples, all social media influencers, all with perfect public images. She showed him a spreadsheet of transactions. They're paid to house and rehabilitate children from troubled situations. The kids become props in their content, showing how loving and charitable they are. And the real parents? Usually caught in legal battles, their reputations destroyed. The foster families paint themselves as saviors while the biological parents are vilified in the media. Raya's voice was tight with controlled anger. Nathan's been funding this network for years. It's not about protection, it's about control. These children are silenced through luxury and manipulation. Inside the facility, Alara sat in her standard wheelchair, watching Patricia Harris record another perfectly staged Instagram story about their newest blessing. The woman's voice dripped with artificial sweetness as she described how they were helping this poor dear heal from her trauma. Alara forced her face to remain neutral, even as her stomach churned. She'd learned quickly that showing any negative emotion resulted in privileges being revoked. Access to books, time alone, even bathroom privacy. So she played along, smiling weakly when prompted, nodding at appropriate moments. Later that night, while pretending to sleep, she heard Patricia's hushed phone conversation through the thin wall. Yes, Mr. Wren, everything's prepared for tomorrow's statement. Patricia's voice was professional, stripped of its usual social media warmth. The script has been memorized, the outfit is perfect. Very innocent, very grateful. We'll have her thank you publicly for understanding her confusion about that night. Alara's hands clenched beneath her blanket. They wanted her to lie, to paint her own abandonment as a misunderstanding, to thank the man who left her to die. But Alara wasn't helpless. During her daily therapy sessions, really just staged photo ops, she'd noticed the cleaning robots that maintained the building. Simple machines, programmed to follow basic routines. While Patricia was busy with her phone calls, Alara had studied their patterns. One bot in particular caught her attention. It passed by her room every night at 1:45 a.m., heading to its charging station. The maintenance panel was secured with a basic screwdriver lock. Child's play for someone who'd been building drones with Jonah. Using a paperclip she'd bent into a makeshift tool, Alara had accessed the bot's control panel the previous night. Its programming was rudimentary, designed for easy updates. With careful adjustments, she modified its routine. Instead of returning to its dock, it would bump into the fire alarm pull station at exactly 2 a.m. Now, as midnight approached, Alara lay in bed counting minutes. Patricia and James were asleep in the next room, their phones finally silent. The facility was quiet, except for the soft whir of air conditioning. At 1:45 a.m., right on schedule, she heard the cleaning bot's familiar hum in the hallway. Her heart pounded as she tracked its movement. 15 minutes felt like hours. Then, at precisely 2 a.m., a mechanical thunk was followed by the piercing wail of fire alarms. Sprinklers activated immediately, spraying water throughout the building. Shouts and footsteps erupted as security guards and staff responded to the emergency. Alara moved quickly. She'd left her wheelchair unlocked, positioned perfectly beside the bed. In the confusion of flashing lights and spraying water, she transferred herself into it with practiced efficiency. Patricia burst into the room, her face mask askew. "Everyone out! Follow emergency procedures." But in the chaos of evacuating staff and other residents, Alara slipped away from the group. Instead of heading toward the main exit, She wheeled herself down a side corridor she'd memorized from her daily observations. The service closet was exactly where she'd expected, third door on the left. Inside the cramped space, surrounded by cleaning supplies and spare parts, Ilara reached beneath her leg brace. Her fingers found the hidden GPS chip Jonah had built into it. With trembling hands, she pressed the activation sequence. Miles away in a dark alley behind the facility, Jonah's tablet emitted a soft beep. He and Raya hunched over the screen, watching as a small dot appeared on the blueprint overlay. "She's moving," Jonah whispered, his voice thick with both pride and concern. "That's my girl." The signal blinked steadily, showing Ilara's position in the building's east wing. Around them, fire trucks began arriving, their sirens piercing the night. The plan was in motion. Red emergency lights strobed through the facility's corridors as chaos erupted from the fire alarm. Water sprayed from ceiling sprinklers, creating a misty haze that mixed with the flashing lights. Through the confusion, Jonah moved silently along the maintenance hallway, his boots making no sound on the wet floor. The keycard he held, provided anonymously by Ava's former professor, gave him access through the service entrance. In his earpiece, Raya's voice crackled. "Main security is distracted. I've got them focused on the front evacuation. You've got maybe 10 minutes before they sweep the building." At the main security desk, Raya flashed her detective badge, commanding attention with authoritative gestures. "We need to establish a proper evacuation perimeter," she insisted, keeping the guards focused on protocol rather than surveillance feeds. "Where are your fire marshals?" Meanwhile, Ilara's heart pounded in her chest as she huddled in the supply closet. The small space smelled of cleaning products and damp cardboard. She'd managed to wedge herself between a shelf and a large bucket, making herself as small as possible. Water dripped from the sprinklers above, running down her face like cold tears. Footsteps approached outside. Ilara held her breath, her fingers gripping the arms of her wheelchair. The steps grew closer, then stopped. She heard the handle turn. Terror gripped her chest until a familiar voice whispered through the crack, "It's me, Birdie." Relief flooded through her as Jonah's bearded face appeared in the doorway. He moved quickly but gently, helping her from the chair into a collapsible frame brace he'd brought, one of Ava's old prototypes modified for emergency transport. "Hold tight," he murmured, securing the straps. The brace supported her legs while allowing her to grip the frame with her arms. It wasn't comfortable, but it was mobile. They made their way to the maintenance stairwell, Jonah supporting most of her weight as they descended. The metal steps were slick with sprinkler water, forcing them to move cautiously despite their urgency. Above them, voices echoed through the building as security began their sweep. "Something's not right," a guard's voice carried down the corridor. "Check the east wing again." Jonah's earpiece crackled again. Raya's voice was tense. "They're starting to figure it out. Move faster." They reached the bottom of the stairwell where it opened into a loading dock area. Raya was waiting by a service door, her badge ready. "This way," she whispered urgently. "The car's just outside." They were halfway across the loading dock when a shout rang out. "Stop right there!" A security guard emerged from a side door, his hand moving to his radio. Before he could call for backup, he lunged forward and grabbed Jonah's shoulder, trying to pull him away from Ilara. In that split second, Ilara made a decision. Using all her upper body strength, she threw herself backward in her frame brace. The momentum caught the guard by surprise as the metal frame swept his legs out from under him. He crashed to the concrete floor with a grunt. Raya moved like lightning, her handcuffs out before the guard could recover. "Stay down," she ordered, securing his wrists. "Official police business." Through the service door, they could see their getaway vehicle, an unmarked sedan with tinted windows. Behind the wheel sat an older man with silver hair and kind eyes, Professor Chen, Ava's old mentor. He started the engine as soon as he spotted them. Jonah helped Ilara into the back seat while Raya kept watch. As soon as they were in, the car pulled away smoothly, maintaining a careful speed to avoid attention. Ilara's hand found Jonah's and gripped it tightly. "Are we running again?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Jonah squeezed her hand back. "No," he said firmly. We're going to finish this. In the front passenger seat, Raya pulled out her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she accessed a secure server. On her screen, a progress bar appeared. Uploading to Federal Prosecutor's Office, encrypted files. The files contained everything. Nathan's financial records showing the shell companies and foster family payments, the original drone footage from the forest, internal memos about reputation management, and most damning of all, Alara's authentic medical report. The document clearly showed that her injuries weren't consistent with the car accident Nathan had claimed paralyzed her. The truth was finally being set free. The glass and steel tower of Wren Technologies gleamed in the morning sun like a crystalline monument to progress. Inside the main presentation hall, hundreds of people filled the rows of seats, journalists with press badges, investors in tailored suits, and politicians eager to align themselves with the next big tech innovation. Camera crews positioned their equipment strategically, preparing to broadcast Nathan Wren's latest technological breakthrough to millions. Behind the scenes, amidst the controlled chaos of tech personnel and stagehands, 4 figures moved with practiced precision. Raya Lin, wearing a production assistant's headset and carrying a tablet, directed crew members with confident authority. Professor Chen blended perfectly with the other technical advisors, his silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses lending him an air of academic credibility. Jonah, clean-shaven for the first time in years and dressed in black crew attire, kept to the shadows of the wings. And Alara, wearing a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, sat quietly in her wheelchair just off stage, hidden behind a partition. Her hands were steady as they rested on the modified controls of her chair, but her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. "Remember," Raya whispered through their earpieces, "timing is everything. Wait for my signal." The house lights dimmed and a spotlight illuminated the stage. Nathan Wren strode out to enthusiastic applause, every inch the polished tech visionary in his designer suit and perfectly styled hair. His smile gleamed as bright as the cameras flashing around him. "Welcome, everyone," Nathan began, his voice smooth and practiced. "Today, we're not just launching a product, we're revolutionizing family safety." Behind him, a massive screen displayed the sleek interface of his new AI security system. "As a father, I know firsthand the importance of protecting our loved ones." In the wings, Alara's fingers tightened on her armrests. Jonah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Our new Guardian AI system doesn't just monitor, it predicts, it protects, it preserves what matters most," Nathan continued, gesturing to animated graphics of happy families behind him. "In today's world where children face unprecedented dangers, now," Raya's voice came through the earpiece. Jonah pushed Alara's wheelchair onto the stage, emerging from the shadows into the harsh spotlight. A ripple of confusion spread through the audience. Camera operators swiveled their lenses. The massive screens above the stage now showed Alara's face. Calm, determined, unmistakably Nathan's daughter. Nathan faltered mid-sentence, but only for a moment. His media training kicked in as he spread his arms wide, his smile never wavering. "My daughter. I'm so glad you're safe." He moved toward her, likely planning to turn this interruption into a touching father-daughter moment. But Alara's clear voice cut through the air like a blade. "Let's show them what safe looked like for me." Before Nathan could respond, the presentation screens flickered. The polished marketing graphics disappeared, replaced by grainy nighttime footage from a forest camera. The audience watched in stunned silence as Nathan's true nature was revealed. His cold voice calling his daughter a burden, the careful preparation of abandoning her, the methodical way he packed up and drove away, leaving a disabled child alone in the wilderness. The footage shifted to drone captures showing Alara's desperate attempts to survive. Documents appeared on screen, financial records showing shell companies, falsified accident reports, evidence of systematic abuse hidden behind carefully constructed PR campaigns. Nathan's face drained of color. This is clearly manipulated footage," he stammered, but his smooth facade had cracked. "Security, cut the feed." But the tech crew, carefully selected and positioned by Professor Chen, made no move to stop the presentation. The truth continued to unspool on every screen, impossible to ignore or deny. The audience erupted in shouts and questions. Journalists leaped from their seats, phones and cameras raised. "Mr. Wren, did you abandon your daughter? Were the accident reports falsified? How long have you been manipulating public records?" Nathan backed away from the podium looking for an escape route, but both exits suddenly filled with dark-suited FBI agents, their badges gleaming under the stage lights. Raya stepped forward, her own badge now visible on her belt. "Nathan Wren," she announced clearly into her microphone, her voice carrying over the chaos. "You're under arrest for child endangerment, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder in connection with your wife's death." The cameras captured everything: Nathan's attempt to flee, the agents moving in, the handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists. His carefully constructed world of lies crumbled in real time, broadcast live to millions. Alara wheeled herself to the podium, Jonah standing protectively beside her. She adjusted the microphone, her movements sure and deliberate. The room quieted, all attention now on this young girl who had survived the unthinkable. "This," she said, reaching for Jonah's hand, "is what real safety looks like." Social media exploded within seconds. Wren exposed and justice for Alara became worldwide trending topics. News alerts pinged on phones throughout the audience. The live stream numbers skyrocketed as people shared the footage, unable to look away from the dramatic scene unfolding in real time. As Nathan was led away between FBI agents, his perfect image shattered beyond repair, Alara remained at the podium, her head held high. The cameras caught every detail, her quiet strength, her unwavering gaze, and most importantly, the protective way Jonah stood beside her, a father not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the kind of safety that couldn't be programmed into any AI system. The media storm that followed Nathan's arrest was unprecedented. News channels ran continuous coverage, analyzing every detail of the scandal. Headlines screamed across newspapers and websites. Tech CEO's perfect family image shatters, the dark truth behind Wren Technologies, and justice for Alara, a father's betrayal exposed. In the courthouse, Nathan sat in an orange jumpsuit, his perfectly styled hair now disheveled, as the judge denied his bail request. The prosecution presented compelling evidence that he had already begun transferring assets overseas and had multiple fake passports hidden in a private safe. "Mr. Wren poses a significant flight risk," the prosecutor argued, laying out documents showing his extensive network of international connections. Furthermore, there is substantial evidence of witness tampering and document destruction in the hours following his arrest. The judge's gavel fell with finality. Bail denied. The defendant will remain in custody until trial. As the investigation deepened, the web of deception around Nathan began to unravel. The foster families who had briefly held Alara faced their own legal troubles. Financial records revealed payments routed through shell companies, scripted interviews, and coached responses. Social services launched a full audit of their foster care licensing system. Meanwhile, in a smaller, warmer courtroom, Jonah stood before a different judge. His lawyer presented evidence of his care for Alara, the modified wheelchair, the survival training, the educational support. Detective Raya testified about his protective instincts and dedication to Alara's well-being. "In my professional opinion," Raya stated firmly, "Mr. Reed has demonstrated exceptional care and commitment to Alara's safety and development. His actions, while unconventional, were solely focused on protecting a child in danger." The judge reviewed the documentation carefully. Given the extraordinary circumstances and the clear bond between Mr. Reed and the child, this court grants temporary custody to Jonah Reed, pending a full hearing. She smiled gently at Alara. "Does this arrangement meet with your approval, young lady?" Alara's voice was clear and strong. "Yes, Your Honor, Jonah is my real father now." Social media erupted with support. Team Jonah trended alongside photos of the pair leaving the courthouse. The public had fallen in love with the gruff, protective man who had saved and cared for an abandoned child. Back at the forest cabin, life took on a new rhythm. The professor visited regularly, bringing advanced materials and technical expertise to their workshop. Together, they spread Ava's old designs across the workbench, carefully translating her brilliant but unfinished ideas into reality. Your daughter was a genius, the professor told Jonah one afternoon, studying a particularly complex servo mechanism. And now her work will help another child walk. The exosuit took shape slowly, each piece carefully tested and adjusted. Ilara proved to be as mechanically intuitive as Ava had been, suggesting modifications to improve joint flexibility and balance. Jonah worked tirelessly, his hands steady as he assembled the delicate components. On a clear autumn morning, they gathered at the creek bed, the same spot where Jonah had found Ilara months ago. The exosuit gleamed in the sunlight, its sleek frame custom-fitted to Ilara's measurements. Jonah helped her secure the last strap, his movements gentle and precise. "Ready?" he asked softly. Ilara nodded, gripping the support bars. The suit hummed to life, its motors whirring quietly as they engaged. Slowly, carefully, she rose to her feet. Tears filled her eyes as she took her first supported step, then another. The professor recorded data on his tablet, but his own eyes were wet. Jonah walked beside Ilara, one hand hovering near her elbow, letting her set the pace. Together they made their way down the creek path, their footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. Meanwhile, Detective Raya was making her own changes. She submitted her resignation to a department that had too often ignored her concerns about vulnerable children. At her farewell gathering, she announced the formation of her new nonprofit, Never Left Behind Foundation. "We will be a voice for the voiceless," she declared to a room of reporters. "A support system for children who have been abandoned, silenced, or forgotten by the system." She paused, smiling. "And I'm honored to announce that Ilara Reed has agreed to be our youth ambassador." The courtroom was packed on the first day of Nathan's trial. Journalists filled the gallery, sketch artists poised with their pencils. Nathan sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, but his usual confidence was gone. Ilara entered wearing a simple blue dress, her head held high. She walked to the witness stand using her exosuit, each step deliberate and proud. The gallery whispered in amazement, but she kept her eyes forward. Under questioning, she spoke with remarkable composure about the years of emotional manipulation, the isolation, the careful way Nathan had cultivated his public image, while privately treating her as an inconvenience. She described the night in the forest, the cold fear of abandonment, and the salvation she found in Jonah's care. "Ms. Reed?" the prosecutor asked finally. "What does justice mean to you in this case?" Ilara looked directly at Nathan for the first time since entering the courtroom. Her voice was steady and clear as she answered, "Justice is not revenge. It's being seen, it's being believed, and it's never being left behind again." A profound silence fell over the courtroom. Even the sketch artists paused in their work. Nathan seemed to shrink in his chair, finally confronted with the full weight of his actions through his daughter's unwavering testimony. When the day's proceedings ended, Ilara and Jonah walked out of the courthouse together. Camera flashes exploded around them. Reporters called out questions, but they moved forward with quiet dignity. Ilara's exosuit hummed softly as she matched her steps to Jonah's, father and daughter facing the world side by side. 3 years had passed since the trial that changed everything. The National Summit for Disability Innovation hummed with anticipation, its vast auditorium filled with engineers, medical professionals, and advocates from around the world. Backstage, 14-year-old Ilara Reed adjusted the matte black exosuit that had become as much a part of her as her own skin. The suit was a far cry from the prototype she and Jonah had first assembled in his cabin workshop. Years of refinement had transformed it into something sleek and almost beautiful, its components working in perfect harmony with her movements. Small blue lights pulsed along its joints, matching her heartbeat, a feature she had designed herself. In the mirror, Ilara hardly recognized herself. Gone was the frightened 10-year-old who had woken up alone in the forest. The teenager who stood in her place was tall, composed, with intelligent eyes that held both wisdom and warmth. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat braid, and she wore a simple black dress that complemented the exosuit. "Everyone thought I was broken," she whispered to her reflection, rehearsing the words that had become her mantra. "But I wasn't broken. I was paused." A stagehand with a clipboard appeared at her elbow. 5 minutes, Ms. Reed. Alara nodded, taking a deep breath. Through the curtain, she could hear the moderator introducing the day's speakers. The summit's theme, Innovation Through Adversity, seemed to have been written just for her. In the front row of the auditorium, Jonah Reed sat perfectly still, his hands clasped in his lap. The years had added more gray to his beard, and fine lines creased the corners of his eyes, but there was a peace about him that hadn't existed before Alara came into his life. He wore a clean black suit, a rare sight for a man more comfortable in flannel and work boots. At his feet lay Rusty, now an elderly dog with a graying muzzle. The retriever's movements were slower these days, but his loyalty remained unchanged. He still followed Alara everywhere when she was home, as if making up for those first terrible days in the forest. Detective Raya Lynn, though she hadn't been a detective for years now, sat beside Jonah. Her nonprofit, Never Left Behind, had grown into a powerful advocacy organization, helping hundreds of children find their voices and their strength. She reached over and squeezed Jonah's hand briefly, a gesture of support between old friends. On Jonah's other side sat Professor Chen, Ava's former mentor and now a close family friend. He was to receive the summit's Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to adaptive technology. His weathered face beamed with pride, not for his own accomplishment but for what was about to unfold. The moderator's voice rang out clear and strong. Our next speaker has been called a pioneer, a survivor, and an inspiration. At just 14 years old, she has already transformed how we think about adaptive technology and human resilience. Please welcome Alara Reed. The audience applauded as Alara emerged from the wings. Her first steps across the stage were deliberate and measured, the exosuit responding to her movements with fluid grace. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as they realized she was walking, truly walking, with technology that looked more like an elegant sculpture than a medical device. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the silent auditorium. Each step represented countless hours of work, failed attempts, and breakthrough moments shared with Jonah in their workshop. The suit hummed softly, its servos adjusting microscopically to maintain perfect balance. Reaching the podium, Alara took a moment to look out at the sea of faces. She found Jonah's eyes immediately, steady, proud, encouraging. The same look he had given her every day for the past 3 years, whether she was taking her first steps in the prototype or falling and getting back up again. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the room without wavering. She didn't need notes. These were her words, her truth carved from experience. 3 years ago, I woke up alone in a forest, she began. I had been left there by someone who was supposed to protect me. Someone who thought I was broken, a burden, something to be discarded. The audience was utterly silent, hanging on every word. But that abandonment led me to a different kind of father, a man who never asked me to be anything but myself, who showed me that family isn't about blood or obligation, it's about choice, about seeing someone's true worth and helping them see it too. Alara gestured to her exosuit. This technology I'm wearing began as a dream in another girl's notebook. Ava Reed was a brilliant young engineer who died before she could complete her work. Her father, the man who found me in that forest, kept her designs safe for years. Together, we brought them to life. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. People call this a story of rescue, of salvation. But that's not quite right. Jonah Reed didn't rescue me. He reminded me that I wasn't broken. I was building strength, building trust, building a future I couldn't see before. Tears glistened in many eyes throughout the audience. Jonah sat perfectly still, his own eyes bright with emotion. Innovation isn't just about technology, Alara said. It's about seeing possibility where others see problems. It's about choosing to stand up when the world tells you to stay down. And most importantly, it's about the people who stand beside you, who believe in you before you can believe in yourself. The crowd began to rise, applause building like a wave. Alara raised her hand, asking for one final moment of attention. She looked down at Jonah, their eyes meeting across the space between stage and audience. To the man who taught me survival, then showed me how to live, who gave me tools, then taught me to build, who offered shelter, then helped me find home. Her voice softened with emotion, but remained steady. Dad, this is for you. The word dad hung in the air like a benediction, spoken in public for the first time. Jonah's smile was quiet, overwhelmed, transformative, the smile of a man who had found his way home after years of wandering in grief. The standing ovation that followed was deafening, but for Alara and Jonah, there was only that moment of connection, of belonging, of family chosen and earned and built, stronger than blood or bone or circumstance. The autumn sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the well-maintained trail as Jonah and Alara walked side by side through the forest. The grove, as it was now known, bore little resemblance to the wild terrain where they had first encountered each other. Solar-powered lights lined the smooth paths, their panels cleverly disguised among the natural foliage. Adaptive technology blended seamlessly with nature, creating an environment that was both accessible and beautiful. Alara moved confidently in her exosuit, each step measured and sure. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the trees, mixing with the gentle whir of motorized wheelchairs and the soft buzz of drones overhead. Jonah walked beside her, his stride relaxed, the tension that had once seemed permanently etched in his shoulders now gone. Remember when this was all just wilderness? Alara asked, pausing to rest her hand against a massive oak tree. The bark had been worn smooth by countless hands, both young and old, using it as a natural touchpoint along the trail. Jonah nodded, his eyes scanning the transformed landscape. Hard to believe it's the same place where I found you. His voice was soft, contemplative. Ava would have loved this. They approached a clearing where several children gathered around a low table, working on various tech projects. Some sat in wheelchairs similar to Alara's early prototypes, while others used mobility aids that looked more like works of art than medical devices. Each piece incorporated elements from Ava's original designs, now freely available to engineers and makers worldwide. Near the entrance, a bronze plaque caught the sunlight. Its surface was polished from countless touches, the words clear and bold. She dreamed in gears and gave wings to wheels. Below Ava's memorial, a smaller inscription read, "The Grove, where nature and technology unite to heal." Alara made her way to a group of children gathered for her robotics workshop. A young girl, perhaps 8 or 9, sat in a wheelchair with her tongue stuck out in concentration as she attempted to wire a small drone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she worked with the delicate components. "Here, try holding it like this," Alara demonstrated, her voice gentle and encouraging. She positioned the girl's hands carefully around the drone's frame. "Sometimes the steadiest grip isn't the tightest one." The girl's face lit up as the connections clicked into place, and a small LED blinked to life. "I did it!" she exclaimed, beaming with pride. Jonah watched from the edge of the clearing, leaning against a tree with his arms crossed. His expression was soft, proud, as he observed Alara in her element. She had become a natural teacher, passing on not just technical knowledge but the confidence that came with it. Other children worked on various projects throughout the space. Some used adaptive climbing equipment to scale specially designed walls, while others sat beneath trees with easels and adaptive art supplies. The grove had become exactly what they'd hoped for, a sanctuary where disability didn't mean limitation and where trauma could heal through creation and community. Detective Raya Lynn's arrival was marked by the subtle crunch of leaves under her feet. She carried an envelope in one hand and wore a casual blazer, a far cry from her former detective uniform. The non-profit work suited her. There was an ease to her movements that hadn't existed during her police days. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" she said, coming to stand beside Jonah. She gestured to the check in her hand. The grant committee was unanimous. They want to fund 3 more groves across the state. Jonah's eyes widened slightly at the news. Raya smiled and continued, "You didn't just raise a daughter, you know. You started a movement." She handed him the envelope. "This is just the beginning." Across the clearing, Alara's student had successfully launched her drone. It hovered steadily at eye level, its small camera capturing the moment of triumph on the girl's face. Other children gathered around, asking questions and sharing in the excitement. As the afternoon drew to a close, Jonah, Alara, and Rusty made their way to their favorite spot, a gentle slope overlooking the entire grove. The old retriever moved slowly now, but his tail still wagged with enthusiasm as he settled between them. Alara pulled out a new notebook, a far cry from the worn one she'd had in the forest years ago. This one was bound in leather, its pages filled with fresh designs and ideas. She began to sketch, the pencil moving confidently across the paper as she captured the scene before them. The setting sun painted the sky in warm hues, casting long shadows across the grove. Below them, children were finishing their activities for the day, their voices carrying up the hill in happy bursts. The solar lights began to activate automatically, creating a gentle glow along the paths. Alara looked up from her notebook and smiled at Jonah. "Tomorrow I'm teaching them how to fly," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. Jonah nodded, his eyes full of emotion as he took in the scene before them. He leaned back against the tree, one hand absently stroking Rusty's fur. For the first time in years, perhaps since before losing Ava, he felt completely at peace. Fireflies began to emerge in the growing dusk, their lights dancing among the trees like nature's own LEDs. Below, children's laughter continued to ring out, free, alive, and unforgotten. If you enjoyed the story of Jonah and Alara, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it, live and unforgotten. If you enjoyed the story of Jonah and Alara, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it,